Doug has his breakpoint, so we can start in case he's doing some editing. So I'm glad to see that all of you gentlemen were able to show up this evening. That's very encouraging. And I hope you're all doing well under the circumstances. It's very turbulent times at the moment. And it's, I think it's an interesting contrast, what's going on out there with what Castro is describing as going on out there, because it puts it in a little bit of a different light than we might normally look at it, or we could at any rate. It all depends on how much we're willing to let ourselves engage and actually immerse ourselves in Kastrup's thought. But in the two chapters, in this section that we're looking at tonight, Refuting Objections, he kind of reiterates some of the things that he said in the part before, but he does it in a more specific, in a more detailed way. This is where he kind of breaks it down and tries to, let's say, take a more systematic approach to the refutation. He's also trying to include some that he didn't in the previous chapters, where he was focusing on presenting his ontology itself, and then some things along the way just obviously pop up as points of criticism or potential criticism that he addressed. So this is a little more detailed look at that part of what's going on. And the first chapter was specifically about those objections, and the second chapter we looked at had more to do with the nature of consciousness itself, and whether there is, where does consciousness end, or is there such a thing as an unconscious? I think that's a very interesting topic as well, because obviously depth psychology has made a career of having an unconscious, and if there isn't one, what are we dealing with there, or what are they dealing with? That's another thing. And for those of us who are a little bit familiar with the work of Jean Gaepser, he wrote a book about the unfoldment of consciousness in history, so over the course of human existence. And he also was a teacher at Jung's Institute in Basel for, I think, about 16 years. And which I found very interesting, because they had a very close relationship on the one hand, but Gaepser very clearly in his work, in his position, there is no such thing as an unconscious. So that's one point where Bernardo and Gaepser kind of agree. I'm going to assume for very different reasons, but it's still an interesting point that it's not an uncontested phenomenon, unconsciousness. There are different ways of looking at it, not just the physicalist or the idealist way of looking at it. So those are the other dimensions. So anyhow, that was, my brief overview of what the chapters were about. But what I think the chapters are about is not nearly as interesting as what you all think was in those chapters, and what struck you as, let's say, the most salient, or the most, or the weakest, either the strongest or the weakest points of the argumentation, or a combination of both. How did you react to this particular set of readings in light of what we've done so far? So that's kind of like where I'd like to start off and gather some input from all of you on how you feel about that. So you can have at it. And the silence is overwhelming.
I'll say something.
Okay.
I think that some kind of resolution needs to happen for anyone who is a Jungian of any stripe, or who has that kind of background. So I was just reading something about images and dream images, this sort of thing. So when you're when you're dreaming, you are in a state of awareness that is, you know, depending on your skill. I mean, some people can sort of wake up in a dream. I'm not one of those people, although I think it's happened to me once. I would just like to see, I would like to see Bernardo find a way to encompass that kind of, you know, that kind of question. I mean, we've got material that is not normally consciously available that I think he could elaborate on. I mean, the idea of a dissociative phenomenon, right? I mean, dreams are not, I mean, is a dream a dissociative phenomenon or what? Is it one where you feel your identity and consciousness of identity is one kind of consciousness that's, you know, reflective, right? So I just think there are a lot of things that Bernardo needs to work on in that regard, as opposed to just saying, well, everything is really conscious if you just get, you know, if you can somehow get there, right? If you could get to it, you would know that it's conscious or something like that. So that's about all I have.
Yeah, what struck me in this last reading was that suddenly Kastrup defines or tries to define this entire chapter, defining engaging consciousness. So I must somehow reconsider and eventually also retract what I said in the first videos or first meetings, where I said he should define what are these words, consciousness, mind, and so on. Here, for me, he doesn't do it satisfyingly, but at least there was this attempt that he makes. I still have a problem because first he writes, of course, we have no, but we can meaningfully discuss unconsciousness, the alleged lack of consciousness. We must, of course, have clarity regarding the meaning of the word consciousness. Then he, however, describes mental activity is conscious if and only if there is something, anything, it is like to have such mental activity in and of itself. And he speaks of an unconscious mental activity, and when mental activity corresponds to experience, if and only if it is conscious. So where is the definition of consciousness? I mean, there is what I see, or perhaps I don't get it, but he first says we have to have clarity regarding the meaning of the word consciousness, and then he speaks about mental consciousness, which is something for me very different. But in any case, then he also speaks about this meta-conscious representation. I had some difficulty to understand, if I must be honest, to understand what he really means, but perhaps it's also what is because I went through a bit hastily and I wanted to finish all until I got here to the session. And that's perhaps also for that reason. And curiously, at the end somewhere, what struck me even more at the end, where he says, well, this is not just a matter of semantics, but in a personal, it was not only, I think it was on the forum, I wrote on his forum that I find that he should define better the words mind and consciousness. And he said, oh, that's only a matter of semantics. And now here I read that he says, it's not just a matter of semantics. So what is lacking for me here is a clear definition, no, not definition, but because as I said, I don't like definitions, but a clear understanding of what we mean by these words. What I liked, however, is this consideration if what we consider to be unconscious or subconscious or inconscient, all these words, nobody knows if they are the same thing, if they are synonymous, so what does it really mean? That he's trying to get after this idea of what it means that something is conscious, or if it really is unconscious. For example, Carl, you spoke about the dreaming state. For me, this is not a state of unconsciousness, or even not, well, subconscious perhaps means it. Sometimes one has very confusing and fuzzy dreams, and okay, we may define this in this sense as subconscious, but there is in any case a subject that experiences something. Yeah? So for me, that is not unconscious, a lack of consciousness. Whereas in modern, also in the philosophy of mind, also among many philosophers, they say waking consciousness is consciousness and everything else is unconscious. So if you sleep, you are unconscious. This is something a physician can say, because if you are a physician and you want to have your patient waking up from a coma, that's okay. From a practical point of view, it makes sense. But for a philosopher of mind, you cannot just say that that the waking state is consciousness and all the rest is not. So I like that he tries to go after this issue. Well, there are also other things to say, but we'll say later.
So I just picking up on this. Let me take a step, okay? Because I think what he's doing on this second chapter is trying to reconcile his ontology, where let's say the primitive is this mind at large, or mind or consciousness. So that is the really fundamental basis of nature, if you want, with, let's say, depth psychology that talks about conscious experiences or consciousness and unconsciousness. And basically what I think he's doing in the second chapter is explaining that it's not, the two things are compatible, okay? Because I think depth psychology also is recognized as quite a strong and a powerful tool, okay, that has been used and still being used, etc., etc. But it's a semantics a bit issue, right? And what he posits in this chapter is that what we call unconscious and unconscious experiences, etc., etc., it doesn't really matter. Everything is conscious in the sense that everything, the primitive, it's consciousness. I think he comes and this is not his, let's say, kind of definitions, but also he takes the definition from someone else between three different experiences. One is the one that basically you are conscious of, basically that you, at this moment, you are conscious, or we can be conscious that we are having this virtual meeting at this moment. Then there is another experience, there is another kind of experience, which is the one that you still have, but you are not conscious. Like, for example, I would say it could be breathing or anything like that. And then there are other experiences that you are basically unconscious and still are there, right? I think he differentiates between these three kinds of experiences. And sorry, the last one is actually the one where even if you, for example, dream, okay, so a dream, that you are able to recall and report. So to bring this eventually, because at the moment that you were dreaming, you were not conscious, but then, and even forgot, but suddenly during the day, you remember that dream, and then you are able to recall that dream and explain it, report it to someone else. This is the re-representation that he talks about. So I think those are the three different kind of experiences, but in the end, you can call them whatever you want. So conscious experiences or unconscious experiences, but all of them basically arise from the same fundamental principle, which is this consciousness, right? And I think also he talks about the dissociated entities, which are us basically, versus in this second chapter, he doesn't talk much about mind at large. It's more about the alters, okay? And I think he tries to reconcile his ontology with this thing, and also some studies around network correlates as well, etc., etc. So he tries really to ensure that his ontology is compatible with death psychology and also the more recent neuroscience experiments, right? And I think he's doing a pretty good job. I was not able to find really, I mean, somewhere that that I would say, okay, I think this is, you know, you could argue differently. I mean, if I would have maybe more knowledge about other experiments, etc., but I don't have that. So I was convinced. To be honest, the idea of these dissociated identities still puzzles me a lot, right? Because it's an essential component of his theory. Because idealist says that everything is mental. I think he's not the first one, but combining these two things and building a theory around that, it's probably, I don't know, I think it's unique, right? So bringing the idea that all universe is mental, all nature is mental, of mental nature, plus then explaining why we have this shared world that we can experience and we can report and we can agree that it's similar world that we see, etc., etc. With a tool of dissociated entities and alters, it's the thing that puzzles me. I think it's quite solid and also based on psychology as well, but still, I don't know. It's like magic, right? It's something that I.
I'm going to try something. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Dissociation is likely when one verbally reflects on nonverbal experience. Okay. I'm going to give you a verbal message. I want to balance feeling with argument. And now I'm going to do something nonverbal. And now I'm going to do something that verbal and nonverbal at the same time. I want to balance feeling with argument. He says in his last sentence, all mental processes may be conscious, but that consciousness itself may be fundamental. I remember an anthropologist, I can't remember his name, but he was in a country that he'd never been to before, and he did not know the language. And he saw, walking along the road, a man who was deaf, a deaf mute. And he was amazed that they shared no language, they shared no culture, but that they had a communication that revealed to him that this man was going to another village to take care of an elderly relative, a lady, an elderly female relative who was dying of cancer. So he was able to get a whole lot of valuable information without a culture, without a language, without a shared culture, without a shared language. They both had cultures, and they both had a kind of language. I mean, the deaf mute man definitely was able to communicate, but not verbally. So what is it like, he says over and over again, to be conscious? That to me is an invitation to a metaphor or a simile, which is, I believe, the only way we can talk about consciousness at all. It's like something, but you can't talk about what it actually is. And those who are pointing to a brain, oh, good luck. You open up a skull and look at your brain and you say, that's making consciousness. I say, oh, please. So also, I just want to add something. So your conscious mind, you can go to a park and you can lie down on the grass and you can look up at the sky, and your conscious mind can be aware of clouds floating in the sky, of the sounds of the children playing in the playground, of feelings of warmth in your body, while your unconscious mind is relaxing muscles, relaxing memories of a movie, or maybe something very pleasant in your childhood, like when you were lying on your back in the afternoon and you were wondering which hand is left, which hand is right, and how many fingers do I have? So I'm just letting everybody know that we are all riding consciously. We're aware of 5 plus 2 minus 2 plus 2 bits of information. There's some who can consciously take on much more than that. And all that other stuff that's going on, which may be inside your body, outside your body, somewhere in between your body and outside your body, these kind of gestalt, foreground, background shifts that are happening all the time. I studied with a hypnotherapist, brilliant man, Stephen Gilligan. He was a student of this man, Milton Erickson, who's a psychiatrist who's writing about hypnotic investigation of psychodynamic processes. And what I just did was a hypnotic induction, actually. And this book, which Kastrup is quoting from, First Person Plural by Stephen Browdy. He's talking about multiple personality syndrome. I don't know exactly where I'm going with all of this, but I don't think Kastrup does either. I think we're all sort of, I think it's all a bit of a muddle, and for good reason. I mean, we can't know everything that we know all at once. That would be absolute disaster. We would blow a fuse. So we have to split conscious mind, unconscious mind. But it's always unconscious and conscious to what exactly, or to whom? So I just want to go back and just say my the therapist that I mentioned, the hypnotherapist that I studied with, who was a student of Milton Erickson, talked about this relationship between the conscious and the unconscious. He used it a lot. It's a language game he used, and it got results for people. But he said he ended up thinking it was just bullshit. That what people mean when they say unconscious is basically what people in the so-called Dark Ages meant by God. It's everything that you don't know right now that somehow is taking care of business while you can do something else. And I think these are, this is very tricky. I will probably press the pause button and just hopefully we'll get a chance to recycle. But I think, oh, another thing, you have to excuse me, I'm a little bit tired because I've been online way too much. But there's something else that, was it Browdy who talked about this? Oh no, it's Milton Erickson, something I think you all might enjoy. He said to, a client came to him and she said she had a dream, and in the dream, there was a gift that she was going to give. And someone told her, remember this dream. And she woke up, and she did. She remembered that she had a dream and that there was a gift, but she couldn't remember what the gift was. So Milton Erickson, very brilliantly, I thought, invited her to go into a trance and to go back into the dream and to remember what the gift was. And then to come back out of the trance, bringing with her what she remembered from that trance experience. And then she did remember. She said, oh, the gift was a box of paints. So I think dissociation is one of those tricky words. It can mean a lot of different things to different people. But this person was not a multiple personality in the technical sense, I'm sure. But I think to some extent we all there's a little bit of the multiple personality in all of us if we successfully survive in the society, which requires us to compartmentalize and to be effective in family, relationship, work, good citizens, and if you have any interest in athletics or art or whatever. So you're putting everything in some sort of arrangement so that you can work with all of these different capacities in different contexts. So we're all very fluid. But I think there's a special case for multiple personality, which I think Browdy in first person plural brings us to our attention. Brilliant stuff. And I think this is something Kastrup is drawing on too, because he quotes Browdy a lot about how one alter can sabotage another alter. And even there are some alters who become murderous. And this is a striking paradox, I think, because that's almost as if one part of the person is so dissociated from the other part of the person that they share the same body, yet that person could have a murderous intent, which would wipe out their identity as well as the identity of the other. So it's a very curious condition, multiple personality syndrome. But there's a relationship, I think, between that and what actors do when they go out on stage every night. They put on makeup, they put on a costume, curtain goes up, they go out on stage, and they kill their wife or their boyfriend on stage in front of an audience. The curtain comes down, they take off their makeup, they take off their costume. Hopefully they don't go home and bring any of that with them into their personal relationships. Although some performers have trouble with their personal lives, as we all know. Movie stars and actors are notoriously sometimes for their personal lives are a real mess. But I think that's just a special case of going to the theater and performing, a very special case of something that we're all doing every day when we have to get up and go to work or whatever, or take care of the kids or go to school and teach a class. So I'm just opening this up. I'm not saying I have any clear definitions of any of this. I don't think Kastrup does either. I don't think anyone does. but we're doing the best that we can with what we've got. So thank you. I'm just sharing a little bit of my confusion with you. I hope this turns into creative confusion, though. Thank you.
Can I jump in just for a second, Daniel, since you got here a little later, just so you know where we're at. We started about 15 minutes before you showed up, but after I gave an overly long introduction about things that you folks had already read, we started going around collecting impressions about what we got out of this reading, kind of like as a first pass. And some of the themes that have come up is the semantic debate, what's meant by certain terms, how they're being used, Kastrup using them, how we generally understand them. Kyle had mentioned dreams, lucid dreaming. How does that all relate to this conscious, unconscious kind of thing? Jaime pointed out that we're trying to, he sees Kastrup trying to reconcile findings in step psychology and neuroscience with his own ontology as well, and explain those kinds of things. And John picked up on that theme of, well, what's consciousness at all? Can we actually define, describe, clearly state what it is, or do we only approach it metaphorically? This was a point that Marco had also brought up along the line. So we've been kind of just feeling our way into what these two chapters have been doing for us, or to us, as the case may be, over the course of our reading. So that doesn't get you completely up to speed, but at least you know what we've been doing.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm terribly sorry for being late, and thanks a lot. Very kind of you that you briefed me in. And yes, indeed, I can see the discussion around the concepts, like what we mean about unconscious and conscious, and I particularly also am interested in that division that he tries to see, that he tries to do, that and relating it to the metacognition, like that kind of like we are always, there's always consciousness, but there is not metacognition. There is that sometimes there isn't, or like from what I understand, that we are even conscious in our deep sleep at some level. There is some kind of consciousness, but there's no metacognition, so that's why we don't recall. But yes, happy to join in from here.
I think that, yes, even when you're asleep, there's something that's conscious. If that were not so, you would roll out of bed and fall on the floor. So there's a part of you when you are asleep that knows where the edge of the bed is. On a good night. I mean, you may have an off night.
I wanted to say, John, you do realize that about 500 Americans die each year from falling out of bed. So
Why does that not surprise me?
I'm going to begin with, I just have a lot of unresolved feelings about this whole read. And, you know, I did my classic thing of putting my feet on the ground and kind of sensing into it. And as I worked my way through it, my feet became clay. And I have kept having unresolved feelings about this or that. I was very taken by his part about the key is attention. In some part, this is where are we putting our attention seems to be, I resonate with, because Zen is always saying attention, attention, attention. But he added the point that attention itself is a kind of metacognition and it's self-reflection. It's not necessarily the universal consciousness, the way I understand it, that I read it. And so this is all kind of moving fast for me sometimes when I was reading and trying to actually cogitate, I guess, on it. I got a clearer feeling with his specificity and his arguments of exactly what he's attempting to do. And that made reading the whole chapter very workable it became workable without being a strain, especially in the second chapter. I still have a lot of unresolved feelings about how he's trying to posit maybe how the two ontologies, and pardon me if I'm saying this wrong, of materialism and idealism can function, I don't know about together, but there's a third way to bring it to a third way that's trying to form, not bringing the two together, but a larger space for the two. I don't know. That's what I took with chewing on the bone of this work this week. So thank you.
Can I just add one little thing to that, Michael? Now you know why I thought it might be a good idea to have a reading group.
Well, I knew you had a reason. I knew you had a reason.
Yeah, because you read this, and you know, for me, I'm reading it again. This is the second time through for me. So it's a different book than the first time I read through it, because I had a lot of questions about a lot of things. And fortunately, in the course of our discussion so far, you gentlemen have brought up a lot of those things that struck me. But since everybody kind of brings, it's like you mentioned with your Zen practice, you bring yourself to the reading. So that influences what it is that you think you're going to see. But that to me is the real advantage, because it provides that slightly different vantage point that I wasn't getting, so that I can get another look at what that was. And that's what I find helpful. That's why I'm really glad that we're able to, you know, to have these sessions and kick this around. Not that I think any of us, because one of the things that I've heard so far out of what we've said in the first part of our, we're all still not really sure what he's saying specifically, or what he means by what he says. There are still some open issues there, which I think is understandable, because as John pointed out as well, it's really hard to talk about what it is you're using to talk about it. You know, if we weren't conscious, we wouldn't be able to talk about it or communicate. So I'll go back to his anthropological example that he brought up. So we're trying to communicate about something, and we only have the tool that we have, which is our language right now. And it's very difficult to do that, because every one of us has our own kind of meaning of what does it mean when we say conscious and unconscious, and is that really significant? When I was doing a lot of Rosicrucian stuff, they also bring up this conscious unconscious, but they also kind of have an underlying understanding that we're all conscious all the time. And if that were in fact the case, why not use it? So one of the exercises that we got along the way was, if you've got some conundrum, something real problem that you have, don't try to figure it out. Tell your unconscious, quote unquote, whatever that might be, to do it for you. And just send it in, because according the way to their ontology, it's always awake and it's always active and it's always doing things anyhow, and it needs things to do. So give it something to do and it'll do it, because it doesn't really make that distinction like we do between focusing, that's an attention thing, or paying attention perhaps, or whatnot. And interestingly enough, at the oddest moments, maybe not perfect resolutions, but new impulses for approaching problems do come back up. And it makes you wonder, well, where do they come? I even gave mine a name, you know, it was Claude. I could just tell Claude, you know, to go work on this. And later Claude would just report back, and this is what I got, boss, we'll put it that way. And then I had a new impetus for doing things, which has gotten me over, especially as a non-engineer working in engineering. It was very helpful to have somebody that had other accesses to information that I didn't have, for example. Just along those lines, although not explaining anything that he might be doing, saying.
Frequently, it comes up the question, what is consciousness? What do we mean by consciousness, etc., etc. I mean, sometimes I think it is, shouldn't we agree that consciousness is the only thing that we know for sure? Because consciousness is not even something that we experience, that is out there. Consciousness is that which allows for experience. And if you're not a zombie and completely automaton in the sense of Descartes, and you should know what consciousness is. So the problem is not to know what consciousness is. The problem is more of a verbal kind of the problem is how to communicate this. So I think that the best approach is that to take the first person approach. Instead of trying to explain what consciousness is just say, get into inside of you instead of looking outside of you. Everyone knows what it feels to be like, not a bat, but perhaps oneself. No? I don't need to explain you if you're not how do you say, colorblind. If you're not colorblind, I don't need to explain you what the color red is. And so I think we need to take this first person approach. And that's something I'm also trying to, you can also experiment with this. Recently, I tried to do this with trying to figure out what it feels like and what it is, this being in this half sleep state of consciousness. When you fall asleep, what is this half sleep? This is neither waking state nor the dreaming state, and not even, of course, the sleeping state without dreams, has a deep sleep. And I figured out that when I'm in this state, I'm fully capable of thinking, of a rational thought. I think of my things exactly as in the waking state. And the only difference is that I detach from what we call the external material world. There's a sort of forgetfulness of the external perceptual world. But my cognition is still fully intact, and I work exactly as in the waking state. And that's interesting, but it is something that I cannot explain you. I can only tell you, this night when you go to sleep, try it out, and you will see. Maybe you can also have a different experience, and we might disagree. That would be interesting, by the way, to see if these accounts overlap or not. And what I found also very interesting, and Kastrup only mentioned it very briefly, he talks about also the sleepwalking. What about these people who's, I don't know, maybe some of you, you know, children usually, a lot of children use to sleepwalk. I remember my brother used to sleep, and in fact, I must say, he looked a bit like a zombie in that case. But I don't know if he was really conscious. I have to ask him again, maybe next time. And sleepwalking, then there are also strange states of consciousness, if we might call them like that. What about in the hypnosis, state of hypnosis, deep meditation? multi-personality, we already mentioned that. And also an interesting thing is blind sight. I discovered recently that there's this, you know, that there are people who say that they are blind, and or they have only a very limited sight. They see only a spot and not the rest. No, sorry, the contrary. As I understand it, they have the sight, but at the center, for some organic problem, I don't know exactly. I'm not a physician. I don't know this. They have a blind spot, and they don't see nothing. And you show them the pen, and they say, "What do you?" You ask them, "What do you see?" They say, "I don't see nothing." And then you say, "Okay, I have the vertical pen or the horizontal pen. Try to guess what you see." And in 80 or 90% of the cases, they guess it right, which shows that there is something subconsciously, so to speak, that sees. So what is that? What is lacking for me when I read these philosophers of mind? Not so much Kastrup. Kastrup is going in this direction, and that's what I like. But most of these philosophers of mind, yeah, they mention these, okay, but they don't try to get them figure out and put it in a more general picture, and they don't try the first person perspective. Yeah. Okay, with blind sight you cannot do it, but with the half sleep state, I would say hypnosis. I would like to try this out maybe one time, but I'm a bit scared about that. But interesting, huh?
Yeah, it's interesting. You started off about how, and Marco, just help me remember, of consciousness and experience. Consciousness already exists, and it's out of that we experience. Did I get that right?
Yes, I personally distinguish between consciousness and experience, because this is also another issue. You will find a lot of people who say consciousness means that you must always be conscious of something. Well, I'm not sure of that, because maybe we can be conscious of it. It is consciousness conscious of itself without necessarily being conscious of something, and that's what also people what people coming from a deep meditative state report, that one can be in a perfectly state of perfect attention and awareness without being aware of nothing. So from the logical point of view, it sounds like a wordplay, but of course, because again, you need a first person experience, otherwise words cannot convey the real meaning of these things. So yeah. Experience is one thing. Consciousness, of course, if there's no consciousness, then there's no experience, but not the other way around.
Yeah, and I like that you brought it up, because I think, and you brought up meditation, of working with this interplay of our experience and consciousness. There's an interplay. Consciousness, for myself, is that which is, this is a clumsy way to say it, that tends to be beyond my experience in some sense. My experience may come out of consciousness, but at the same time, if in meditation, if you're working with your first person experience, you're actually, from what I've learned, you're kind of helping your experience relax so that you can at least acknowledge this consciousness from which your experience is coming. I don't know if I said that right, but I'm trying to be very careful of my description. It's just one description. In other words, part of meditation is to stop being so attached to your experience. And I think that's essential, even with reading these last few chapters. Is what I was feeling into is how and I've known this for a long time, how my very concepts or ideas can affect my experience, which can affect the way I act in the world. Now, this is just my layout. That's all. This is my first person report. So thank you.
Yeah, I had the same thought that, yes, first person descriptions are, they are sort of their own evidence. They're self-evident, right? So what, you know, when you have a dream, nobody can really tell you dream something different. Of course, then you get into dream interpretation, which I won't get into. But the first person thing, you know, when you have a dream, or when you have a hypnotic experience or meditative, like Mike was talking about, if it's something you can remember, it seems to me memories are generally true. I mean, when I know there's such a thing as false memories, but that's something different. If I can remember a dream, then I would have to say that I did experience that dream. I don't know, you know, there are dreams that you don't really remember, but you know you had a dream, but you couldn't say what it was about, right? That's pretty common. But still, you could argue that you did have an experience. So it's really tricky, isn't it? I don't know how else to say it, except it's tricky, and Kastrup does talk about dreams and points out just what I'm pointing out here. I mean, I give him credit for at least doing that much, but I would like to see him go farther and talk about, you know, the sources of creativity. For example, when you get a creative spark, when you get something that you did not consciously originate, it just, you know, you go to sleep and you wake up in the morning, you've got a new thought, and you've got a new take on something that you couldn't figure out. And just like you were saying, it's there's something there that's not it's not simply a matter of calling it conscious or unconscious. That's not the most important thing about it. You know, really the content is a lot of times really what's striking you, right? About a dream, you've got there's an image that that stays with you, and so I think I would have to give Kastrup credit for trying to accomplish that, you know, trying to encompass all these different kinds of conscious experience. I think that's a hard thing to do, and but I'm still not satisfied. So I'm not sure what it would take.
I hear you about not being satisfied, and also recognizing. I think Kastrup is brilliant, and I believe his project supports a lot of what I think many of us have experienced, either directly or indirectly. I just want to bring up the idea that there's beliefs about consciousness. That would be epistemology. And then there is the first person phenomenological account. I was walking down the street and I saw a friend of mine. We said hello, and this is what happened. And I know that to be so. and that's, I think, something that we can share intuitions about. You can hear someone report that first person account and you could sort of say, okay. But then you have someone like Jean-Paul Sartre, and when I read this when I was in my early 20s, who said, you cannot say your name in a dream, because if you say your name in a dream, you will wake up, and the dream will stop and you will wake up, because the dream is unconscious. So I said, well, I don't know about that. So I had a dream, and in the dream, I was in a dream, and I said, oh, I'm going to try this out. I'm going to say my name. And then I did, John Davis. And I was still dreaming. I went, oh, okay. And I went on and I did other activities with the characters in the dream. And I woke up and thought about that experience. So there's metacognition operating. My beliefs are pretty fluid. I'm pretty open. Jean-Paul Sartre was not open. He had never had this experience, so he therefore claimed it could not be had. So he has a very strong belief, which he then probably maintained. And I think that's a tricky thing when we confuse epistemology, phenomenology, ontology. These are big, very expensive words. And I think they cannot be easily separated. But I had, so Jean-Paul Sartre, of course, said, you know, lucid dreams are not possible. But then Stephen LaBerge, I think in the 80s, and there was someone named Kenneth Hearn. I think he was in the UK. LaBerge was at the somewhere in California, Stanford University. And they were in the laboratory experimenting with people in sleep, and they were able to hook them up so they knew what their brain waves were, you know, alpha, beta, delta, theta. And they arranged to have a signal. So the sleeper is paralyzed, right? Your body is paralyzed when you're asleep, except for your eyes. So the message was between the dreamer, the sleep dreamer, and the investigator, who was looking at the monitors to determine the brainwave state. When you enter into a dream, make a left-right with your eyes. That would be the signal to the experimenter that you were dreaming, okay? And they were able to verify that indeed there was a direct correlation between the brainwave state when the person went into a dream state and the signal, the eye signal. And this has been repeated many, many times in many independent researchers around the globe. And this has now become established, that lucid dreaming is not just for fantasy-prone individuals, but that this has a status. I don't know if it's ontological, epistemological, or phenomenological. I think it's a little bit of all of that. So I think this is the challenge for us, is that sometimes our belief about consciousness keeps us stuck in a very, in an epistemology that we need to outgrow. And I'm sure that's true of an certain the ontological status that we might have, some of us, for a fifth dimension, which I'm working on right now, because I have had 30, 40 years of lucid dreams and out-of-body experiences and telepathic experiences. So it's not just happening within my own sensorium, whatever that might be at any given time of the day, but that you can also link up with the sensorium of another and the sensoriums of many others in certain states of consciousness. And you can be metacognitive simultaneously. So you can keep track of all of that. I'll give you one simple experiment, one experience that I had when I was doing body work, and I've talked about this before, but I had we were working with absentee healing, where you send energy to another person who's not in the same physical space with you. And there's a certain technique for that. And then we were each invited to go to another part of the house. And the group would send energy to that individual, and that individual would come back, join the group, and talk about their experience. And I had a really weird experience for me. And it created some cognitive dissonance. So the woman who was in the class, she went to another part of the house. We all went into this very subtle state experience. We were in a meditative state, and you center this energy. And I remember very consciously, metacognitively, I imagined her body. I imagined that my personal pronoun I, could move into her body space. And when I did that, my physical body started to cough, very intense, painful cough. And it was a very searing experience in my throat center. And then I calmed down and the coughing subsided. And then she joined us. And we were talking about the experience, what that was like. And I mentioned to her, I said, I found myself with an intense discomfort in my throat, and I started to cough. And I said, do you have any issues around your throat? And she was wearing a turtleneck sweater. It was wintertime. And she pulled down her turtleneck sweater, and she had a goiter in her throat, right? And she said she had a thyroid condition. So I thanked her very much, but I reflected upon that experience, and it made me aware that we are very complex, and we pick up on all kinds of things, verbal and nonverbal, within our own sensoriums and within the sensoriums of others, both human and non-human. And I've had telepathic experiences with animals, with other humans. And I think I think Kastrup is exquisitely aware of these anomalous experiences that don't fit the current paradigm. I use that word paradigm very loosely because I'm not sure any of us know what we were talking about when we were talking about paradigms, because there's probably more than one paradigm going on at the same time. But I think this is, that's why I think he's a friend and an ally of those of us who, if we've not had direct experience of these paranormal experiences, these anomalies that don't fit the hardcore materialist assumptions. I think he's opening up some space where those who are making these outrageously arrogant claims, like Jean-Paul Sartre saying, you cannot say your name in a dream because dreams are unconscious and you would wake up. And then I proved him. I was a 20-year-old kid. I wasn't a world-class famous philosopher, but I woke up that next day after having that experience and said, Jean-Paul Sartre is wrong. And many years later, Stephen LaBerge and other researchers were able to prove that, yes, indeed, you could have lucid dreams. So anyway, I'm just sharing this just to open up the field of all possibilities for us, because I think definitely Kastrup is an ally for those of us who are sort of been marginalized by mainstream materialist science, which probably includes most of us. Thank you.
Thanks. It was very good, John. I think precisely the beauty of Kastrup's paradigm or theory is that it provides, let's say, for the Western kind of mind, an explanation. I mean, even if not in detail, at least it's compatible, right? And I think this is what I like also, because I believe it's not that personally I have got the richness of experience that you've got, but I've got also some experiences, and I find really difficult to explain them in the, let's say, physicalist paradigm, let's put it this way. And I always had the intuition that there was something wrong, okay, with this the physicalist paradigm, unable to explain those things that are so true to one's first-person experience, right? So, so I think I fully agree with you, and that's the reason that I am very fan of Kastrup, because he's trying to bridge this gap between, you know, the Western kind of reasoning tradition and physicalist, at least in the last couple of centuries, kind of a paradigm, and the idealist, which by the way also was Western, but we seem to have lost it along the way, right? And now he's trying to recover, so I'm really happy. And also to pick up on something that Marco was and you are very insisting, no, in the kind of definition of consciousness, that everybody of us understand what consciousness is. Really, I mean, I think it's we can agree on when we are asked, okay, are you conscious, or what do you understand by consciousness? I think we have an experience of that. But the moment that we try to explain that and put names, and it's where really we lose completely the kind of you know, in that translation, basically the meaning get lost. And I think that's the reason that it's so difficult to find the definition. And I think Kastrup is trying to use this one, which is a metaphorical one in the end, right? So what it is like to feel like you are conscious. I mean, it's a bit of a, I don't know, a strange one, but probably is the closest one that in our words we can get to what we really experience, because this is a raw experience, right? I mean, we can self-reflect on that, but if I need to report that to you, then I have to use words or even non-verbal communication with my hands, etc. But it still is a language that I have to use, and then it's going to get lost. And I think that's the problem. Also, I feel that there is a problem when consciousness itself tries to explain consciousness, right? So it's like this infinite regress kind of thing that we get stuck, right? But then we have to use words, and then it's not possible. But still, he's trying to make that to give that explanation, because it's the only way really to talk and discuss and argue with physicalists. If you go and trying to have a different kind of a debate, I don't know, even a debate, because a debate implies talking, right, and arguing. I think just referring to first person experiences, you're not gonna get the buy-in of those guys. The simple fact that all academy it's based on papers, you know, and scientific, you know, experiments and arguing, etc., etc. It's already, you know, it's already preventing you to go into a completely into a different way. So I think, and I believe he's doing a very good job in providing all that analytical philosophy, right? To try to build this paradigm and explain it. And I think it's quite powerful, all the explanations. I find in some of because there have been so many people talking about philosophy of mind and consciousness, etc., in the definitions, awareness, the different conscious experiences and conscious experiences, what is, you know, that it's a very slippery kind of area. So, and because there are so many definitions and so many people that has given their own definitions, and even Kastrup mixes a bit different, it's a bit difficult sometimes to follow, but I think he's, at least in what I've read, I was satisfied with, given all those limitations, right? I mean, I think it's already an outstanding job that he's done.
So I want to respond with something that you said, Jaime, that about lost in translation and interpretation. But first I have to tell a story about what happened to me yesterday when I was walking to get something to eat. I ran across a homeless person that I've seen around, and he's definitely mute, but he talks, you know how some mute people talk. And I was walking past a Goodwill and he was looking in the window and it was closed because of the virus. And he was just, you know, I could read his gestures. I could feel the gestures. He was upset. And I go, the virus. I had to impromptu talk, you know, reach out to him. And I got across to him why it was closed, and because of the virus, he sensed it was closed, and I said, be safe. And he said, thank you, you know. And so when it comes to translation or interpretation, to me, it's about how close to the horseshoe, you know, when you throw horseshoes, how close can you get? You don't have to get it 1-1. Now, the old saying is it's either horseshoes or elephant farts. So sometimes you end up in a, like you're pointing out of a whole mess. But I guess what I'm trying to acknowledge, that being on this site and reading Bernardo, I think we need to give ourselves permission, you know, that we're close, but do we have to be right on top of it? I wonder, why do we have to be right on top of it sometimes? If that makes sense.
Yeah, can I respond to that? So one thing that Kastrup says in, where is it? Oh, it's early on. It's like in the early part of the note to my readers of previous books, I think. And he talks about how in other books he has relied on metaphors to express things that are very difficult to express in what he calls an analytic style, which is that is the style that he has written this book in, right? This one we're reviewing now. So the idea that, you know, like they say, like so many people have said, well, this consciousness is about, this is what it is like. This is what it is like to have this experience, which is somebody here pointed out that is describing sort of a simile, right? A simile or metaphor. And it's difficult. It just seems like it seems really difficult to try to do the same, cover the same ground without the use of any kind of metaphorical language that he's used in, you know, he's got a book that's called More Than Allegory, which I have also read, which actually I enjoyed a lot more than this book for that very reason. But anyway, I was struck by, I hadn't heard that observation before, that when people talk about, when they use that phrase that is so common, that it's about, this is, you know, this is what it's like to have a certain experience. I found that very insightful to think of it that way, that, you know, we're talking about something metaphorical right from the start. So what are we trying to do with our analysis? We're really trying to somehow bridge an enormous abyss, not just a gap, right, between people who get it and people who don't get it, you might say. And so I think people just have to try harder to get it. If they don't need to get it, they won't get it, right? If they don't need to get the metaphor, then they won't. They'll just keep doing what they're doing. Anyway, that's my thought.
It's an interesting, this whole idea of metaphor is a very interesting one because depending on whom you talk to, our language is primarily metaphorical anyway. It's impossible, actually, for us to not speak in metaphors. And depending on who you're talking to, estimates can be as high as 80% of what we say is metaphorical in some sense, because it's so hard to get a hold of the things as they are in and of themselves. That's why I always found it interesting when you're talking to, let's say, fundamentalists who want to take their religious scriptures literally. I don't know how you take a metaphor literally, because what you're being told in that text is also a metaphor. So trying to literalize something that's metaphorical just kind of gets you in a loop. But what they have in common, it goes back to what John had said, our beliefs actually determine a lot of what we do. And if one of our beliefs is, I can't be open, otherwise something unhappy will happen to me. Some people are very comfortable with how they see the world and how they understand it. And when they open that up and someone else comes along with another idea that challenges that, it actually goes, in a sense, to the root of their being. And it's like, well, I'm not, if I accept that, then I'm not going to be who I am. Well, most of those cases, they don't know who they are anyhow, because they never really stop to think about it, but they have an idea of who they think they are. And that's this, or a belief of who they think they are. And John's had enough experiences, and we've all actually had more than we are probably aware of these anomalous experiences. I'm not a lucid dreamer either, Kyle, but I've had dreams where I thought that might have been, but I don't know for sure, and I wasn't able to figure it out. But I certainly wouldn't deny that there are such a thing, because I know enough people who report on them, and I trust those people, and I think they know what they're talking about, and the things that they tell me tend to be relatively consistent over time. So, well, why should I doubt that? And some of the few anomalous experiences that I've had have always worked to my benefit. So why would I reject them? It's like, well, okay, if it has to be weird to work out, why not? I'm not against that. But having a belief in something, and this, I find this, if you're a dyed-in-the-wool academic who lives by being quote unquote right, well, then you have to be right all the time. So in order to do that, you have to make categorical statements that things are thus and so. And the whole game that they play is that others who have to be categorically right will come along and say, well, no, it's not that, it's this. And so you argue. And this, I agree with Jaime. I appreciate that Bernardo went out onto that dance floor to dance and said, well, I'll do that with you, and let's see what we get. And we end up with a very, if you're willing to be open to that, you find a very interesting little show going on. And it's a show that is not just entertaining, but it can also be rewarding or fulfilling or informative or stimulating in a lot of ways, not just intellectually, but perhaps emotionally. But deep down, we all believe something. But most of us don't know what it is that we really believe. And I'm aware of people who will tell you flat out they're afraid of knowing that because it would change too much. I can respect that. But that doesn't happen to be a problem that I have. So I'm like John, well, let's be open to these things. let's see what else it brings. And because I found that my experience has always been that things have become richer because of that. They've never become paler or insignificant or threatening or whatnot. They've always become richer because I have you know, more variation, let's say, within the scope of my actions and thinking and whatnot that that I consider a benefit rather than a hindrance.
And maybe we can also say that there are people who have this belief system because they are afraid of losing something. Yeah? And when I think of scientists in particular and these philosophers and these hardcore materialists, I think there is a fear of losing their mind, their intellectual power, their rational analytic thinking. Because if you think of these things only from the purely rational level, you won't get very far, because an experience is not an irrational. You can explain it with rational and analytical expression, words, and way of thinking, and models and whatever you wish, but an experience is something that goes beyond the pure rationality. And if you want to go to the root of these things, you have to put aside a bit your mind, so to speak. You don't need to lose it, but the mind, you see that the mind has some place, and that's place, and they are afraid to lose their mind, and that's, I think, one of the problem. And that's also why I have this fixation, you now realize, with the fixation of others, with the obsession of Occam's razor. In the typical scientific point, or the typical scientific argument is, well, maybe this is true, but we don't need that, so let it cut out. Maybe consciousness is not just an epiphenomenon of the brain, it may be more. We have no reason to believe that. Why don't we have no reason to believe it? Because we want to see it always from the third person perspective. If you refuse the first person perspective, you automatically are compelled to put and there is this obsession with the Occam's razor, which says always there is no reason to believe that, or no reason, we don't need that, because we must stick at that. And if they would take the first person perspective, I think that they cannot, because otherwise immediately they see that this thinking is flawed. And yeah, we say that language is also always metaphorical. Yes and no. I think language can help us, and words can help us to point to experiential states, to experiences. For example, sometimes an example, something that I do very often is I simply see that there's a difference between mind and consciousness. How? Why? Yeah, mind is made of thoughts. They come and go. What is a witness? There's a witness that sees these thoughts coming and going. What is the witness? What is this witness? I cannot describe it to you, but you know that just from your experience. So you point by discourse and with the language to something that helps them maybe to go beyond their assumptions and beliefs. But I don't think it is so important to convince these physicalists. It is much more important to speak to those who feel inwardly that all this materialistic representation of the science of consciousness, philosophy of mind, coming from the materialist point of view, is somehow flawed, makes not really sense, but they don't know what exactly. They have only a feeling that there is something wrong with it, but they cannot tell exactly. To those people, I think, and I think that maybe now they are growing. We have a good chance to be in a good company, maybe in the future sessions, so to speak.
Yes, that was very helpful, talking about mind and thoughts and the witness. And I think the many meditative traditions make this the area of study or inquiry. It's very central. But I also think there's a difference between thought and thinking. And the metacognitive capacities are engaged in thinking about thinking about feeling, having feeling about thinking. And this is with that the metacognitive capacities are about have a from to kind of orientation. So there's always an aboutness, an intentionality, as the phenomenologist would say, which is not exactly the same thing as a goal. So it's very confusing, this language. But I just wanted to point that out because I think his paper is focusing on the conflation between consciousness and metacognition and the mental. So he's talking about mental processes may be conscious, but the consciousness itself may be fundamental. So there may be many other processes besides the mental. And this, I think, is where a lot of those mistakes are made by confusing consciousness with mind, mental, the metacognitive. So I think there is a place for language, and it's very important. I think Kastrup points that out. It's like the ego can formulate questions and ask from the unconscious, and the unconscious can give an answer. And this can be very creative. And it's something that we humans draw upon. We have language, we have operational chains where we get together, and like if you think about our ancestors, they had a spear. They practiced making spears and using spears to hunt game so they could feed their family. Then there came the bow and the arrow, right? That was another kind of technology. And then they learned how to make a trap. These are different kinds of technology, but the purpose is the same. But there's a direction that you see it, the spear comes before the bow and arrow, before the trap. And these are achieved by cognition, a shared cognition, where persons shared attention, they pointed, they made language, they made a plan, they acted upon, implemented, experimented, revised. And I believe we see these artifacts in archaeology, and we try to reverse engineer them to figure out what the cognition, the metacognitive capacities of these ancient peoples were, and how similar and different they are to us. And I believe we're still engaged right here on this call with perhaps new operational chains that may start emerging out of the questions that we use about intentionality, cognition, metacognition, different states, epistemology, phenomenology. and I just want to quote briefly a passage from this first person plural, this book that Kastrup quotes from a lot. He says, in distinguishing a phenomenological from an epistemological sense of self, there is no reason to suppose that the more general phenomenological epistemological distinction is sharp, nor does any of this imply that there can be a purely phenomenological or epistemological state or sense of oneself. In fact, it is clear that many qualitative features of experience presuppose a belief system or worldview, which predisposes us to experience certain types of things rather than others. So I think this is sort of a subtle point that he's trying to make about epistemology and phenomenology and how they, one can dominate the other in sometimes ways that actually create very bad trance states. Oh, this is something I would like to have, but this expert over there tells me that's not real. So, okay, I give up. I think that's sad because I think we have enormous capacities potentially that we, you know, are ignoring or denying. Oh, or we have these anomalous experiences that, oh, well, that's what happened, but it's not possible, according to so-and-so, that I can have these experiences. Therefore, okay, it's just a hallucination. Let's just get on with business, you know, as usual. And I think we're at a time in our culture right now is running out of gas. Our economic institutions are falling apart, and they're toxic, all kinds of toxicity in the air that we breathe and the water that we drink. So I think we need to recognize that we need new epistemologies, we need to update our epistemologies, and we need new ontologies. And I think this is where Kastrup is a real ally. And I think we have to do this. This is urgent. And it's not something that would be interesting if we did this. It's something that either we do it, if we don't do it, we're not going to be here very long. And I think I'm not being a doomsayer by saying that. Anyway, I think this is a very interesting challenge.
I just wanted to quote, now that we were talking about mind, consciousness, thinking, and all this, something that I found a few days ago, and I was really surprised because I'm trying to revisit a bit some of the old Greek pre-Socratic philosophers, etc. So this is Parmenides, actually. It's from a poem that I think he wrote, and there is a piece which Simplicius captured. It's called Fragments from Parmenides, and this is the part which is called Concerning Truth, and it says the following: therefore, thinking, and that by reason of which thought exists, are one and the same thing. For do we not find thinking without the being from which it receives its name? So basically, what Parmenides is saying is that thinking and by reason and that by reason of which thought exists are one and the same thing. I find it really interesting because I think it's basically exactly the same ontology, you know. So he's proposing or summarizing the same ontology as Kastrup, which is basically nature. It's mental, and everything is just. I mean, thinking probably it's a very broad term here, right? But this is the kind of patterns of excitation of this mind at large, right? And I was really happy to find that, because that was from a pre-Socratic, okay. And I don't know if it just that because there is very little from these guys. Okay, everything is captured by other people, etc. So there are no original pieces of work that are saved from that time by them, books or something like that. But I don't think it's a coincidence. Probably he was already onto this from many centuries ago.
But
Yeah,
in fact,
saying
yeah, okay.
Oh, go ahead.
Ahead.
I really like that quote. Go ahead.
I will post it in the and also the reference.
Yeah.
And by the way, I just wanted to also mention the conclusion from the paper, because I think also how I started, know that he's trying to reconcile his ontology with this kind of depth psychology, which differentiates between conscious and unconscious. So he says in the discussion part, our impression that some mental processes are unconscious may arise from A, they're consisting in non-self-reflective experiences not amenable to introspection, or B, they're being strongly dissociated from the executive ego and therefore inaccessible to it. But in a way, he's saying that all mental process, so I have elaborated on the hypothesis that there may be no such a thing as an unconscious mental process. All mental processes may be conscious, in the sense that there may be something it is like to have such mental processes in and of themselves. So I think this is how he basically, it's a whole defense and reconciliation with his ontology, that what it's basically the materialist would say consciousness arises from very complex organizing matter in our brains. Okay, so there is consciousness, but then there is something that is not conscious. Okay, it's something else, but it's not conscious. So basically Bernardo Kastrup says, no, sorry, everything is conscious, but there are different kind of mental processes that you can tag as conscious, because you are able to report them and self-introspect, and some others not. But actually, even using this neural correlate of consciousness, you are able to physically see that there is brain activity, so there is something going on, dreaming or whatever, without eventually the first person. I mean, it's not possible other than just asking that person, have you dreamt of something? And maybe that person will say, no, sorry, or I can't recall anything. But there was a lot going on that whole conscious mind, if you want, alter, right?
So I don't know if this is the same person you quoted. It's spelled Paracels. Is that the same person?
No, Parmenides.
Okay, well, this is a Greek person that says this: speech is not of the tongue, but of the heart. The tongue is merely the instrument with which one speaks. He who is dumb in his heart, not in his tongue. As you speak, so is your heart. I just find that interesting, going along with what you were saying, Jaime.
Very good quote also. I like it.
Yeah, great quote. I think
yes.
That there is also something to the nowadays we speak of the emotional intelligence. What is that?
Yeah.
And from the analytic mental point of view, well, emotional intelligence, no, we don't. We are not emotional. We are rational. Yeah. But I think there is this something. Also, this idea of the intuitive. We speak always of the subconscious, inconscient, and conscious. But what about the supraconscious? There may be something that goes beyond the mental consciousness. Huh?
Yeah.
But of course, Occam's razor comes in. We don't need that. No?
Yeah, and therefore rationality gets to define what is intelligent and what's not. It seems by Occam's razor, they're basically saying, I know what's intelligent. Okay, nobody else does. The rational capacity does. And I don't want to dismiss rationality. It's a useful part of capacity, but it's not all we are. We're not just that.
And by the way, it's also a very anthropocentric point of view. This idea that rationality is the ultimate tool with which we explain everything is paradoxically just science, which says we are not so anthropocentric, we have gone beyond anthropocentrism, we are Darwinian. We know that Darwinian evolution is true, and this has been also but just for this reason you should become aware that mind and rationality, the intellect, is only one step of the evolution. You cannot just, but okay, I think I have already said that. I don't want to repeat that. But one point that I wanted to make, well, I forgot. I probably was unconscious when I was thinking about that. So yeah, that's also an interesting point of view. The role of memory, when we say we are unconscious, how can we say that? Is it because we don't remember something, or we were really unconscious? I don't know, by the way, what it means to be really unconscious. But in any case, there is also this problem. And the rationalist simply says, well, if we don't remember, we were unconscious, but maybe you don't remember. But we don't need to posit this hypothesis. Just cut away and just say everything that you remember was conscious, otherwise it's unconscious. So it's so it's so poor reasoning, I think, and which does not want to go a little bit beyond one's nose. They see only what's here now. I now remember. I became conscious again. This idea, the thing with Parmenides, the Greece philosophers. And this reminds me also of the fact that there are a lot of things that we are now rediscussing again in the modern philosophy of mind, modern science, and which are not new at all.
Exactly. Yeah.
Also, this idealism is old as dates back to the times of Plato, with his cavern and the shadows and so. And this is impeding because if we stuck to our ideological background and belief system, we don't see that we are not making a progress, not because it is not possible, but if we exclude a priori some possibilities, we prevent ourselves to progress. To make a very practical example, a very recent example, I see that nowadays that there is this development of so-called plant cognition. They are making experiments with plants, and where they see that also plants have some form, I don't call it consciousness because, well, this is maybe, I don't know, but they are able to make decisions, and they seem to be able to have some primitive form of cognitive functions, which we believed were only possible with the brain. And what I was surprised that a lot of these articles say, oh, well, there was already someone in the 1950s and the 1960s who discovered that, and everyone forgot about that. And now we are rediscovering these experiments. So it was not a technological limitation. there was an ideological limitation,
Yes.
because there were also already peer-reviewed papers written on these things half a century ago, and they were simply ignored. So that's and this doesn't happen only in one instance. I saw this several times, especially in this field. It's very interesting. It says a lot about the sociology of science, I think.
Yeah, I'm just wondering this notion of cognition, and I don't know if it would be how cognition and rationality might not necessarily be one and the same, but they seem to be linked. But I'm pulled to what Johnny shared with the spear, the arrow, and the trap. All that came about with survival, protection, trying to survive, protecting ourselves. So I think what I'm hearing, I don't know, I'm just positing this, that part of our rationality is still governed by the need of the survival mechanism, that if anything threatens our belief system or our ideology, immediately, whether it's subtle or not, it goes to Ed's point, are we being open, or are we, you know, like as we're doing right now, everybody's hunkered down. Everybody's in, you know, social distancing, you know, out of the need for survival. And what we haven't learned is when to unhook from that very instinctual capacity and maybe bring a different way so that we're not locked into the survival mechanism as much, using our rational capacity, metaphor coming as a sword to cut things up.
Just two notes. First of all, still going back to what John told about how he figured out that Sartre was wrong, that I can also relate to that. I, like, in my early 20s, I also got into lucid dreaming. I was studying social psychology and I got into lucid dreaming, and also went read the Stephen LaBerge and the study how they were managed to prove how it's possible, because otherwise it wouldn't be accepted. So I can relate to the experience of having having that kind of experience that is not accepted by the status quo of the psychology mainstream. And one of the techniques actually in lucid dreaming is to have reality tests during the day. So in order to induce a lucid dream, there are different techniques that one can practice, like most of them related to mindfulness. And one of them is to be constantly, or during the day, remind oneself that is this a dream or is this reality? Am I in a dream or am I in the physical reality? And at some point it transfers to the dream. So at some point in a dream, one asks, it's like one saturates his own mind with that, and you can transpose it to the dream state, and then suddenly you get the awareness, the lucidity that, okay, this is a dream, and from then on. And then another, so you talked about Parmenides. Are you aware that Bernardo Kastrup?
Yes. It was on the back of Bernardo's that in one of his essays, recent essays,
Yeah,
that he talked about another philosopher also talking about Parmenides. Perhaps.
Peter Kingsley.
Exactly, Peter Kingsley.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. So he raised.
Exactly, and then I went and started reading some of those fragments, and I found this piece. It's not very long. What you can find actually of him, you find a lot of interpretations and and explanations, etc. But actually, the fragments themselves are not really very long story. And obviously it's a translation, you know, from Old Greek. So translations also are a bit dangerous, okay, because sometimes they can, you know, drive the meaning towards what the translator in this case, which is probably another philosopher, it's trying to convey, but it is what it is, right? And I found this, and I thought it was really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So from what I understand and remember, Bernardo or the Peter Kingsley, I haven't read the book yet, but what Bernardo, I think the main point is that Parmenides has been misinterpreted. Like even the Western culture was misled by the ideas of Plato of that how one should interpret Parmenides is it's makes a whole lot of difference how we should think about reason and about the ideas.
Exactly. No, it's very interesting. He talks about two ways of inquiring, and one is the right way and the other one is not the right way. So so he mentions there is and there is not, and there is the right way and there is not. So whenever you make assertions like there is something here, this is a good the good path to knowledge, but there is not is not. It's a bit it's a bit difficult to explain that, because it sounds a bit esoteric, but then it starts making sense really. So yeah, it's something I will post a few references there, and you can go and read. I found it very interesting, and as Marco said, many of the things that we are discussing today were already kind of brought up by those guys, so they seem to be quite stable, maybe in different works, different language, etc., with different metaphors, okay, that maybe today seem to be a bit out of context, but then there is a very plausible translation with today's language, and it makes a lot of sense, and you say, hey, this is exactly the same what this guy now is saying, that it's, you know. So I don't know where I read that everything, all the new, more recent philosophy were footnotes to Plato, actually. So yeah.
It's Whitehead. Whitehead said that.
Whitehead, okay.
All of philosophy is a footnotes to Plato.
Exactly,
great
exactly.
book.
So yeah, and yeah. Yes,
were you talking about Bernardo's response to Kingsley, or to reading Kingsley, right? He wrote an essay.
To reading Kingsley, yes, that essay, yeah.
After reading, yes, I thought that was really excellent.
Yeah.
I would write, so yeah.
And I think on this rationality, Michael, that you were talking about, which goes associated with this high order thinking and self-reflection, etc., etc. Actually, you can read in Kastrup's also, you know, that this is not a necessary feature of consciousness. And actually, he says that even mind at large, he's not even there in saying that eventually mind at large would be self-reflective, right? Which is quite, let's say, interesting, because that would be anthropomorphing the whole thing, right? And I would agree with you that I think it's more of a feature that helps the survival of the ego rather than anything else, right? So in a way, I think that perhaps rationality, it's restricting to live a more a fuller life, right? Because it makes the ego much bigger and the center of everything. And the ego is just the tip of the iceberg of who we are. And therefore just concentrated on the ego and basing all our experience on trying to rationalize everything. And this is something that I came to that conclusion, not rationalizing probably in a different way, that I am really getting jailed in this rational world, and I'm not living a full life. Okay, I'm missing a lot, and I think, but it's very difficult because the ego is so powerful, it wants to survive at all costs. That is, it's really, I still a struggle today, right? I mean, at least I am aware that my ego is very powerful, but
That's good. That's
I mean,
good.
I'm confined at home. I'm confined at home, right? So
yeah. Well, Suzuki Roshi, a Zen master
because
from
of my ego.
Suzuki Roshi from San Francisco Zen Center had a talk, and he said you need just enough ego to get across the street. That's being mindful. That's what we have to practice. You know, I'm not going to get rid of my ego, but I'm going to put it in its right place. That's the practice. And listening to you guys having these conversations, I mean, as I'm listening, my ego's has many voices, as we were talking about, going, that's bullshit. No, I've never heard that before. Where's that coming from? You know, but it's entertaining in a certain, because I've done a lot of practice of how to keep it. Okay, settle down, ego. Settle the fuck down. Thank you.
Well, I know we're getting ready to wrap up. I guess what I've learned today is that I need to do a little more research on memory and state dependency. I know they did some studies where they had students memorize material while they were sober, and then they memorized material while they were drunk. And then when they were sober, they were asked to recall what they had memorized, and they couldn't do it when they were
Yes,
sober.
I read that too.
But when they got drunk again, they could remember it.
Yeah,
So
I read
there's
that too.
something about the states we're in that encourage recall and maybe discourage recall. I mean, we remember, we forget that we remembered. There's some people who forget that they forgot, and that's very unhealthy condition to be in. I mean, Alzheimer's seems to be epidemic right now, along with other things that are epidemic. But I'm just going to quote briefly. This is a biological fact, and I've known it since high school, but I'm thinking about it again. And the cells in your body have been replaced many times. You are literally not the physical person you were many years ago. There must be some information or patterns that defines who you are and tells the cells how to grow. This applies not just to healthy, but to diseased cells. Theoretically, if all the cells are replaced, any diseased cells should just disappear on their own. This doesn't happen because of patterns of information. So even though our cells are dying at different rates, the cells in our stomach, the cells in the heart, the cells in the lungs, the cells in the livers, they're all dying and being replaced at different rates. But there's something that's stable enough that holds us together. But that a disease process, even though the cells are dying and being replaced, will still come back and maintain. And I'm just curious about state dependency and memory, and probably and going in and out of different states, and what we recall and what we remember has a lot to do with whether in a waking state, a sleeping state, a spaced out looking out the window, reverie kind of state, a good mood, a bad mood. And I think this is a lot about quoting from Milton Erickson and the woman who had a dream, and in the dream, the character in the dream said, "Remember this dream." And she woke up, but could remember a certain important feature of the dream until she went back into a trance state. And then she could recall, oh, now I remember the gift that I was going to give in the dream was a box of paints. So the information was still there, but the state she was in, a waking state, prevented her having access to it. I think we all know this. Every time we wake up at night, we knew we had a dream. We can't remember exactly what it was. If we train ourselves and write it down right away, we sometimes can capture some of it. But a great deal of it is always going to be lost. And maybe for very good reasons. I mean, we have other obligations besides, just what's happening in these dreamscapes. But I think the more attentive we are to different kinds of states and the transitions between the states, we may have much more satisfying and fulfilling lives than when we're living in very truncated and fragmented states of mind and body, where we are not able to coordinate our rhythms together in a kind of holistic fashion, as we have different kinds of rhythms, circadian, ultradian, diurnal rhythms. And, we need to coordinate these rhythms, I think, more intelligently than we have in the rational phase, where especially the deficient rational, which is monetizing everything. And I think that monetizing, instrumentalizing tendency of the deficient rational to quantify everything and to seek for profits, the highest profits, as quickly as possible, is disturbing very fundamental rhythms that we need to really get clearer about this. So I'm really grateful that we're all having this opportunity to, hopefully create conditions where we can re-educate ourselves about these immense potentials that we could possibly activate and maybe lay down the tracks for a new phase of creativity and concern and care and ecology and ecological awareness. So thanks. This is great.
Yeah, that makes me think, John, that when you brought up state dependency in that sense, that I have kind of expanded, that it's very useful from my experience of how my actions and my state are so entangled that the more attention, like you have brought up, or mindfulness, and I'm using that words of how our state can be in an irrational state, or a sick state, or angry state, or whatever, and it can dictate our actions. Where if we bring some, whatever you want to call it, attention to what that state feels like without being threatened. I think this is what's important, and what I've learned from my trauma work, without being threatened by that state. It's there, but I just breathe, or I have techniques to slow down and not deny the experience, so that I can make more informed, efficient, rational decisions of how to act. That's what's come forward for me around what you just expressed, and thank you.
John noted that we're just about, well, we've already gone past our time. It's not that we have a limit or that we have to get off, or that Zoom's not going to process the video if it's too long. But there does come a time when I personally need to start shifting gears again. There's so much I can take of a good time. And then, and one of the things the Germans say, you should always leave the party when it's at its highest point. So, yeah, but at any rate, so if anybody has any final thoughts they would like to share before we go our separate ways, I'm going to try to set up a page for the next part of the book, like I have for these, so we can get together in a couple of weeks and continue this discussion. I'm finding it exceedingly beneficial. All of the hopes that I had when I first suggested it are coming true. So this is a good thing for me, for sure. That you guys keep showing up, I have to assume that it's doing something for you as well. So anybody want to share anything before we go our separate ways?
I just gotta go, but yeah, I agree with you. I think it's very worthwhile. And have a good couple of weeks, guys.
All right.
Nice
Sounds
to
good to
meet
me.
the group.
You guys.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Take care of yourselves. Take
Bye-bye.
Stay
care.
healthy, everybody.
Thank you. Yes, stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Stay
Bye-bye.
safe.
See ya.